Welcome and thank you to everyone who did choose to come back and have their lunch in here. I really appreciate it. And I also really appreciate today that we've got Loren and Kelsey and Daisy and Tom and Christopher who jumped in last minute to help us out because we all know Carlos is at home and that's where he should be while he's resting and recovering. Carlos, when you hear it later. What I really wanted to open today was to get everybody on the panel's feelings for is, what for you has been the most inclusive workplace that you've worked in the last few years? What are the attributes of what you'd call a really inclusive workplace? Do you want to start with tell us off there, Kels? I can start since I've got the microphone at the moment.
I think the thing for me is really actually, you can tell when people are trying to understand other people's perspectives and they're respecting them and they're actually giving you that freedom. They're not just expecting you to be the same as everybody else and fit that mold and do everything exactly the same. And really actually clearly showing that they're appreciating the differences between people and what those differences can actually bring to everything that you're trying to do together.
That's incredible. How about yourself, Loren?
I guess one thing I'd say is when there's proactive efforts to be inclusive rather than reactive. So looking around for ways that they can be more inclusive in actions they can take to include different types of people and different groups and in different ways rather than only being responsive when there's an issue that comes up or feedback.
Makes a lot of sense. How about you, Chris? Have you?
Let's see. I think places where colleagues and especially leadership make an effort to understand what people's needs are and how they can make a workplace better for people.
It's incredible. Thank you.
Yeah, I think probably some of the most positive experiences I've had have been, I think as sort of a couple people already reflected, a company where they've decided from the start the sort of company they'd like to be and tried to work out how they could get there. Which I think makes it mainly the younger companies that I've worked for, because it's usually the younger ones that have had an emphasis from the start on how they want it to feel to be working at that company.
I think for me, it's kind of goes to what Tom was saying, but also a slightly different experience to what Chris mentioned, is that it's often, the more inclusive workplaces I've encountered, that inclusion has come from the rank and file employees that you're working with. In particular, often the work to make inclusion happen falls upon the people that aren't included, whereas some really positive examples of environments I've experienced recently was, I've pushed for changes to our software to help our trans and gender diverse customers and other users, and people that aren't part of that group have kind of picked up the work of making that happen from a technical perspective, from an internal politics perspective, and really pushed that, but still critically included me and included the other people in that group, rather than found the nice middle ground between doing things about us without us and between letting us do all the work. Found that really good middle ground.
That's an amazing middle ground to find. And I know certainly it's not something every company gets there. Have you got any advice to, I want to say, some of the leadership that we have out there that could breach the conversations in a better way?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me is you kind of have to actually care. We can tell when efforts are coming from a genuine desire to do something, when it's just box ticking. I remember another workplace I worked at, just being in this environment that was really queerphobic, really sexist, and a lot of harassment happening, and doing the mandatory harassment training. I don't know, I'm sure everyone here has been through that, box ticking exercise with a little flash video, and it was just added salt to the wound being in this really hostile environment and listening to this inane tutorial about how to not harass people. And yeah, the other thing I'll say is that it does, like Tom was saying, it's much, much easier to build an inclusive culture from the start than to turn the ship around.
Thank you. And That's some good thoughts. Kelsey?
Just a quick point on that harassment training thing. Like at one point we got given, the harassment training to go through, and as a neurodivergent non-binary person, there were several points in there that I felt horrible because of the examples they were giving. Like, they were hurting me, the examples in this training. And I think that's something people actually need to think about when they're putting these things together, is the audience for that training includes the people that get hurt by it. And you're exposing them to that hurt again. Even if you're saying afterwards that was a bad thing to say, I still had to read that, and it still made me feel miserable when I did. So it can be quite an interesting thing there.
Do you think there's a way that it could be breached better in that space? Because it's definitely an area where there's very much of we need to put something out there, but doing it without necessarily that due care.
Yeah, it can be really difficult, because I understand why they want to give examples of what not to do, but yeah, when you're putting those examples in front of the people who have dealt with it all the time, I think you're just bringing that hurt back up again and opening up those wounds. So
it's very true. I'd be really interested, Loren, you coming from definitely, let's call it not New Zealand, and certainly we'll call also not APAC at the moment. There's definitely been a change in the last year or so within the United States around inclusion and diversity in workplaces, but also a shift from looking at times of a lot of hybrid and remote work to coming back into the offices. Is there something you could talk to us about in that sort of space? Provide some insight on? Apologies. Not good with microphones yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all experienced the changes since COVID to a lot more people getting the opportunity to work remote, or being forced to work remote, depending on the situation or your perspective. Definitely opened up awareness of how different workplaces and environments and styles affect people, and what can be really more welcoming to different ways that, people with different kinds of brains and different kinds of lifestyles, neurodivergence and parenting and all different things. I think along with a lot of other compassionate policies and perspectives that people were adopting more during lockdowns, that's eroded a bit over time, and there's been more compulsion to come into the office or to do away with the awareness of what's accessible to people. But I think there has been a permanent change, at least in the U.S. and the workplaces I've seen. I mean, there are places that are expecting people to come in 5 days a week, but it's bizarre how that would be, remote work was so rare in February of 2020, and now it's like shocking to people if you're asked to be in 5 days a week. So I think that has changed as a permanent standard, I would say, but it's definitely reduced how willing people are to take that different perspective.
Yeah, so I'm based in the US these days and happened to be interviewing a fair bit in May and June, and there's definitely a marked difference between the more established organizations that had offices before the pandemic versus the startups and younger businesses that I interviewed with. I found that the younger ones were definitely all remote first or remote only in many cases, and I ended up joining a company that was remote only. Before the pandemic, I was working remotely, but for organizations that primarily had offices. So that's definitely changed, and the changing attitudes as restrictions ease and people decide the pandemic's over, even though it kind of isn't. There's definitely attitude differences depending on the age of the company.
The other thing that's really interesting to me is that the lockdowns that we had, especially sort of here across Australia and New Zealand, especially in Melbourne where I now live, there was a lot of time for self-reflection, and that resulted in a lot of people realizing things about themselves. I'm probably one of the earlier quarantrans people that realized that they were trans or gender diverse during lockdowns. People have realized that they're neurodivergent in some way, are autistic or have ADHD, and found things about themselves, changed things about themselves, found better ways to do work, particularly with neurodivergence, found ways to make that work for them. And that sort of push from companies, particularly the established ones with big offices, to just bring everything back to how it was, kind of cuts a little different to, I think, even how they're intending. And it's also really interesting to me to see the companies that have tried to do that but have found pushback from their staff, and kind of just how much that highlights that when workers work together, we have power. Join your union.
Can totally understand that aspect of it. One of the things you touched on there that I probably would be quite interesting and a little bit more on is, I know you touched on the words that it was kind of part of the quarantine trends.
Yes, the quarantine trends.
Yes. It's probably something that this audience may not have heard that much about. Would you be able to give a little bit more information as to what you mean by that sort of experience?
Yes.
At a time?
So, I mean, the story of how different people, it's a very broad question. I'm trying to figure out how to approach it. Sorry. But the story of how people come to realize they are transgender and diverse is often very different for a lot of people. For me, it was actually someone I was dating at the time was transmasculine, and I, through the process of meeting and talking to somebody who grew up in the social role of a girl and didn't want that, I was like, oh, that's not a thing that everybody wants to be, really. It's just me. Oh, okay, that's something I've learned about myself. But it is something that, increasingly people are learning about themselves at a much younger age, because there's more awareness that's being talked about, not always in a good way. But it's still very common to see people discover their true identity much later on in life, particularly, when we are established in our careers and, may want to transition while at a workplace. When I first transitioned, I wasn't at a workplace. I was at the same workplace that I mentioned earlier, where I just knew that I couldn't transition and still do my job and be respected. So I had to leave that workplace, and that's not the sort of workplace that we want to have more.
Definitely not. And thank you for sharing that experience. I put it out there to the panelists, and certainly to Tom, who's been sitting a little bit quietly here. And it's putting this out there to Tom, who's been sitting here a little bit quietly so far. Can you give us a little bit of an idea as to why it's so important within the Python user group and within the Python community to have the diversity and to have the inclusion, especially things like these events? Apologies. Apologies. What I'm asking for Tom is to give us a little bit of an idea, certainly as a leader within the New Zealand Python user group, why we want to put these sorts of conversations out there early and want to have these conversations around inclusion and diversity within our area, within IT.
I'll need to speak purely for myself as opposed to maybe the wider strategy that might have long predated my involvement in the community. But from my own experience, what I was saying to you before about trying to retrofit inclusiveness is abjectly disastrous every time I've ever seen it attempted. I was thinking examples of, I know who were interviewing at companies, and they were like, oh yeah, we're really excited to sort of have you. And she was like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, how many women do you have on your team? And they all kind of went pale. They all, how many gender diverse people do you have on your team? And they all kind of went pale. And eventually one of them said, oh, less than 5%. And she was like, do you mean 0? And they were like, yeah. And then she had found out that like maybe 2 months previously, all 4 of the women on the team had quit within the space of a few weeks. And so to the best of my knowledge, nobody wants to be the person who's the first person to join a group where they're the only person who doesn't look like everyone else there. And so if you start even totally obliviously, if it's just sort of me and a bunch of my, white dude male friends make a little club. No one's going to want to be the first sort of diverse person to join that. And so it has to be from the start. And if it is from the start diverse and healthy, then it can grow in all directions and truly be entirely inclusive. And if it doesn't, I feel like the natural follow-up question would be like, if you found yourself in a social group where it is very undiverse, how do you fix that? I don't think I don't know of any answer. I'd love to hear it, but I don't think anyone will have anything obvious. And so, speaking for myself, you just can't let that happen from the start. You have to set the rules at the start for how you want your community, no matter what it is, to continue.
And building on that, having been around the conference organizing circuit in Australia for a very long time now, the events that we were putting on 15-ish years ago were hideously non-inclusive, certainly by today's standards, by any objective standard really. And the deliberate and ongoing efforts that have been made to actually bring women and more gender diverse people into the industry, into our events, has been it's been a difficult thing to do, and it's required bringing those marginalized people into environments with people that are particularly hostile to them, and has been unpleasant, and it's taken a lot of work to make our communities pleasant for them. And it is definitely better to try and start communities with that inclusion built in from the start, because it means that people don't have to go through that difficulty, that trauma, to actually be a part of the community.
Yeah, I also wanted to add to that when we're talking about, whether we're talking about communities like this, or whether we're talking about workspaces, something I'm noticing increasingly is that men, cisgendered, heterosexual white men, still want to be part of a diverse space, and that applies whether you're thinking about a meetup or a job. And a lot of I'm increasingly finding a lot of people that are in that category where that diversity doesn't necessarily directly apply to them, are still kind of putting feelers out and talking to the people that they know and be like, what is this space like? Because they want to feel good where they work or where they volunteer or socialize, and they also want to be a part of a community that's more interesting than just people that look and have the same experiences as them.
I think one of the other things on this topic as well is why is it actually important to be bringing these people into our spaces? And one of the key things I see is that when we're approaching these problems, if you've only got one type of person, that you're only really going to get one or maybe two types of solutions. And actually having those different people with different backgrounds, different brains, different skill sets can really make a big difference in actually coming to better solutions that can work for more people and all sorts of things like that. And so I definitely really notice the difference when there is a wider group of people trying to solve a problem. And I think that, it's one of the reasons why it's important to actually make those people feel included, show the appreciation to them that they are there and they are participating and you've actually got them, and making everybody feel included tends to result in much better outputs.
For sure, 100%. I couldn't agree more in that space. I'd love to get a bit of a sense from some of you, even if one of you is willing to share an experience of one of the more recent difficulties or challenges you might have faced that you've been able to overcome in the space, whether it's trying to get someone new into a group or trying to even extend or stretch your current workplace's thinking or a workplace you've been at in the past.
I think I kind of have one just from the opposite perspective of someone who's very much in the dominant demographic in a lot of these communities. When I was working at a job several years ago, I was co-leading a project with I was the lead developer project, and my friend Jen was the other co-lead of the project, and we were talking about diversity at our company. And I was like, yeah, I mean, it seems pretty good here. And she was like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, you and I are like, it took her a little while to point out to me, because maybe like 60 or 70% of my direct working contact time was with her. So from my own perspective, I felt, oh yeah, no, it's sort of a pretty even gender split here. And she's like, Tom, I'm the only woman on this floor. And I'm like, that's a pretty good point. And so the obliviousness of my own experience kind of feeling fairly diverse because of who my contact time was with, and then just like not taking the bigger picture and going, oh yeah, no, okay. That was a wake-up call for me that was quite useful in sort of looking around with like clearer eyes and going, yeah, we can improve this. I exaggerate slightly. There were 2 women on the floor, but yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of highlights something that I've been thinking about earlier, is that increasingly a lot of businesses seem to be relying on essentially internal opinion polling to measure like a lot of the things that are much harder to measure in their workplaces. And that's really great for getting a sense of, it's great for getting a very simple and blunt instruments view of how a lot of people feel about a thing. But that can kind of, as Tom illustrated, that can kind of cause issues when you're trying to get a feel for, like, if you're asking a survey question, how diverse is the company? If the company's not very diverse, and most of the people answering that survey question have a perspective where they haven't thought about it, then the people that are answering that survey that actually have maybe a more astute perspective on that question are in the minority, and they're not going to show up in the surveys. And the same for more general things like employee happiness or confidence and things like that. If you don't have a way to break that down by the demographics and experiences of the people that you have working for you, there's a picture that you might be missing. And if you do have a way to break that down, that can kind of have problems with privacy and anonymity. So it's kind of, I think, illustrative of the limitations of that sort of a tool as well.
It certainly touches on probably an area that I've noticed of recent too, where a lot of leadership teams and companies will strive to get a specific metric, and they'll strive to get that number to move, and they possibly lose sight of the bigger picture and how they're actually, it's about what we're trying to do, not what number we're trying to move.
I think as programmers, we've got a pretty good idea that metrics can be a terrible way of measuring what's going on. We all know that lines of code committed is not a particularly good measure for how productive your developer is being. And so, sometimes just how many diverse people did I get through the door might not be a very good metric to how comfortable are those people, how are they actually feeling, what's going on. And as we've talked about with the data stuff here as well, like how you look at your data, the questions you're asking, and the biases you have when you're analyzing it can make a really big difference to the results you get out of it and what you think. So, I feel like I tend to look at metrics and things like that as a tool it's almost trying to make it too data-based. It really is a lot more of a subjective thing that you almost need to do more of that qualitative analysis on rather than the quantitative analysis. But that's difficult. People like numbers. Numbers make things easy. But this isn't an easy space to work with, and I really don't think numbers can give you the answers you're looking for.
I think one of the other problems with even trying to do that analysis is if I'm in a space where I don't feel safe or comfortable or respected, I don't feel like it's safe for me or like I'm going to be respected when I raise that. And so, in past workplaces, like the workplace that I didn't feel like I could come out to, I told them I was trans in the employee exit survey that I sent. It's the very last email I sent before I wiped my laptop, closed the lid, and walked out of the building. Because I didn't want to raise that. I didn't feel safe raising that. And so there's a space that there's kind of a zone that a space can be in where maybe things are good, maybe things are okay, maybe things aren't great, but the people that are sort of bearing the brunt of that still feel like they can be a part of helping to make it better, or at least like sharing the feedback. But if you go too far, then there's a point that you can cross where it's really hard to know that you've crossed that point, because the people that can tell you don't feel safe doing that.
Just trying to think of how to take that piece, because that's such a big statement, but it's also, it leans into the, I'd almost say, pressure that me myself as a cis female goes and says, hey, how do I actually start a conversation in this space? Or how do I do it in a way that's safe for people that may not be feeling in that same place as I do at the time? How do you make that kind of first leap if you're someone that's not sure, and then not wanting to put too much pressure on the other side of the fence at the same time?
I think appearing respectful and considering the way that you are asking things and phrasing them is probably one of the biggest things. Like, you can usually tell when somebody's questions are coming from a point of genuine curiosity or wanting to help, or if it's really just kind of mean, or they're just asking because they feel like they have to and they don't actually care about the answer they're getting. And that vibe will really sit with the people who have been asked the question. But it can be really hard for the person who was asking it to actually realize that that's what they've done sometimes, I think. So I think, as we talked about empathy before, it's really thinking about the other person who you are asking the question to and going, how are they going to respond to this question? And, am I giving them room to not answer if they don't want to? And that sort of thing.
Something I'm thinking about that's, I think, related is just when I'm looking at a group or a company and trying to assess, like, is this, are they thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a effective and thoughtful way? One thing I look for is, are they acknowledging when they made mistakes? Because I think there's a lot of workplaces and groups that'll are very willing to talk about the values they hold in theory, but when it comes to applying them, they don't want to show any cracks in the facade, and so it's all shiny, happy, yeah, we value everyone, whatever. But if they can give you examples of how they've done something wrong and what they changed, that makes it feel a lot more real. And also, I think makes it feel safer to share something if you know that they've been able to take feedback in the past rather than get defensive about it. Because sometimes it seems like the best strategy is to deny, and seeing evidence that they've taken feedback well is really helpful, in my opinion.
I think that there's, that's a really great point. But I think one of the challenges I have in terms of evaluating what, especially company leadership, says about their efforts is that it's something that I've seen a lot, both like personally and like the people that I've talked to, is that there's this unfortunate tendency for company leadership to, once an inclusion effort has happened and it's been successful, be like, yeah, the company is this company, we're a really great company, we're doing all this inclusive stuff. And then if you talk to the people that were actually responsible for making it happen, it turns out the company leadership has pushed back every step of the way, and it's just made it really hard for this effort to happen, and then taking credit for it once it has. And it's really hard to, you kind of have to rely on sort of the whisper network to find out really what the company is actually like. It's very difficult to find out that information unless you have someone that you can talk to, where you can be like, so what was actually the deal for this?
Yeah, I feel that I identify with having seen the risk of that sort of thing happen with a company that might set a lot of its own identity in being a very diverse place or a very inclusive place. The proof can be in the pudding, right? Like, it can be more difficult for them to identify where they've let themselves down, because it's an admission, tacit or not, that it's like, actually, yeah, we're still making progress in this space, or we still have a lot to learn in this space.
I'm conscious that I've been holding the microphone a lot, so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't holding it too much. But oh gosh, I just wrote to myself, but I can't remember which thing I wanted to talk about now.
Just a tangential point is, I think it is very easy, particularly in larger companies when they're trying to set policy and things, particularly when those larger companies are still, their upper levels are full of the middle-aged white guys that don't have too much going on, and then they're looking at the policy and they're just like, this policy is going to work for everybody. Or just tell everybody that's how it's going to be now. And I think it's very easy to see. You can tell when they haven't really thought about it. And the way I often put it is, you can tell when a policy's kind of been designed for the lowest common denominator. And they're like, this is just going to work for everybody. It'll be fine. And then it really often takes a lot of the people who it's not fine for to actually stand up and push back and go, well, actually, have you thought about this? Have you thought about how this is affecting everybody? And again, it's one of those places where worker solidarity can make a big difference when you're actually going, hey, big company, I've got a problem with this. Have you actually thought about all of the people this is affecting? So, yeah, it can be difficult for it to go all the way out, even if a lot of the people lower down are actually really good about it. So sometimes you'll find a good space, and then there might be something coming out, you're like, ooh. It can be worth trying to improve that space and talk to people and advocate for stuff, but yeah, not everybody has the energy for that. So I think it's one of the reasons that it's important to keep having these sorts of talks and discussions and actually bringing the subject up with people, is to get people who might not have thought about it actively thinking about it and considering it and trying to remove the burden from those affected people in all of their day-to-day lives all the time.
I remembered what it was. So I think earlier we were talking about like the Whisper network and the way the conversations that are sort of happening behind the scenes about employers and workspaces. And I think one of the things that people that are in that the sort of like dominant groups seem to not realize is just how much we do actually talk about these sorts of things. Like I recall having a conversation with a manager in the past about my job title, and I was kind of like, whenever I talk about, whenever I'm in conversations with friends about leveling and remuneration, they're like, wait, you have this job title? I would have thought you would have that job title by now. And he was genuinely surprised that those sorts of conversations were conversations that I was having on a regular basis. But like, yeah, when you're in a minority or a minoritized group, that you have those conversations more often because you're constantly comparing notes to figure out, am I being respected? Am I being treated fairly? Things that you might perhaps take for granted, things that I certainly did take for granted before I transitioned.
And that creates a lot of cognitive load for you on top of your normal day-to-day.
Yeah.
And that in itself can be a difficult thing for people to realize, that carries part of every interaction, and every part of the day in which you're interacting, you're carrying that extra piece.
Yeah, and I mean, this actually goes back to a conversation I was having last night about how especially for me as a trans person, which is a demographic that is maybe between 0.1 and 2% of the population, we don't know because the ABS. But where there's not a lot of us, we're talked about a lot at the moment. So we often face a lot of interactions where this particular interaction, the other person might have never had this particular kind of interaction before in their life, but I have had this particular kind of interaction 5 times today. And it does wear down on you. And but the flip side of that is, for me personally, I'm always happy to answer questions that come from a place of genuine and respectful curiosity. And we can usually, not always, sometimes it does grind us down and we get a bit, I've had enough of this, but we can usually tell when it does come from that place versus when it comes from a less friendly place, like you were saying before.
Very true. And I realised, just for the sake of the fact that we've put these lovely people and amazing individuals on stage in the middle of lunch, I think we'll probably do our best to cut it at this point. But what I really want to grab from each of you as we close off is maybe your one piece of advice that you'd give to your current manager or to somebody that you're working closely with, that would, and I use the words, that would make it easier for other people to be able to open up and have true conversations with each other. So it doesn't have to be your current employer, but that person that you'd have to try and go, can you get this? This is the one thing I want you to think about when you talk to every single person going forward.
My most generic advice that I think is at the foundation of a lot of these issues is really that when I look at the spaces that are the most diverse and welcoming, it's where the most people in them have the most agency and power, because really at the end of the day, being able to ask for something is easier if you know that you're in a position of power and agency, and you don't feel that you're at risk of being fired, or that you're easily going to have another option if you do, or just that that you feel like you have a voice. So anyway, giving people more agency, more pay, more decision-making ability makes all of these things easier, in my observation.
I think the biggest one for me is just remembering to actually sit down and think about things from other people's perspectives, and remember that the position you're coming from and the assumptions you're making are probably not true for everybody. And so really making an inclusive environment is often about respecting other people and giving them the space to go, hey, this is what I need, this is what's going on, and actually listening and showing that you're valuing that, rather than just going, oh, but it's fine. You can come to the office 5 days a week. Everyone else can, right? It's like, no, you need to actually think about what's going on for the other people and consider all of that stuff. So
I think some of the things that these two folks have already said are kind of what I was thinking as well. And in fact, some of them are things that my current management, I'm very lucky to say, do reasonably well already. So that's really good. But I do have a slightly spicier thing that I would say to a past manager, which is that often particularly when we transition to become trans women, the people that were around us, when they assumed that we were men, have this fear or think to themselves, does she remember all of the sexist and transphobic things that I said to her or around her before I knew that she was a trans woman? The answer is absolutely yes.
Came real close. I think I'm going to stick with the theme that I was kind of mentioning throughout, which is it has to be from the leadership. It has to be just as important at the leadership level than anywhere else. Like I was going to say it has to start and go down. It has to start at the top and go down, but it has to be there at the top as well. And if you're sort of saying, oh, I wish this community was more, or organization was more diverse, can we hire more women? Can we hire more minorities? Can we hire more? It's too late. How about you look at your peer group and rearrange them as needed? Because if you don't have it at that level, it won't come from the other levels, because the priorities won't really be there. And people might look and go, oh, I'm not sure that you're not doing this for more than lip service.
I've been running events for a long time, and I know that I've made a lot of mistakes when it comes to inclusion. And on reflection, all the mistakes that I've made have come when I've made assumptions about what would be good for the people that I'm trying to bring into the community and include. And all the times I've got it right, I've actually asked people what would be useful and what would make an environment good for them. So don't make assumptions, actually ask people, and then actually listen. Do what you asked do what the people you ask tell you to do.
Thank you all. For sure.
I just wanted to add something to something that Tom said about it having to start from higher up. It's very true, but something that I think, Chris, you told me when we were talking about how to do a post lockdown PyCon AU is you have to bring the community with you. So once you have that improvement at that leadership level, whichever level of leadership it is, you do have to, at the end of the day, the next step is to make it come from all levels. like from the very bottom to the very top.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I'm so incredibly thankful to everybody who came onto the stage today. I appreciate that you took your time out in your lunch to have this conversation and that you were willing to, in all honesty, follow me a little bit and join me on this mission. And I just want to say thank you. And I also appreciate everyone that came back in during the lunch hour to listen and hear some of the great pieces of conversation that have come out.
And final comment, I guess, is we're finishing up here, but I know this is something I'm very passionate about, and I imagine everyone else here on the stage is too. So if you want to keep talking about it, find us.